Marcus considered the dusty tomes arrayed across his desk, each spine a silent testament to forgotten eras. His current subject, the socio-economic impact of medieval monastic land tenure, offered a precise, verifiable intellectual exercise. He preferred facts, the tangible evidence of human endeavor, to the nebulous narratives of folklore that often contaminated historical accounts. His existence, carefully curated, revolved around the quiet discipline of research, the scent of old paper and leather his most frequent companion. The outside world, with its unpredictable demands and emotional complexities, rarely intruded. The arrival of the official letter, sealed with an unfamiliar crest, was therefore an unwelcome disruption. He slit the envelope with a blunt letter opener, revealing a formal missive from a firm of solicitors. It detailed the unexpected demise of a distant relative, a great-aunt he barely remembered, and the subsequent inheritance of a property, Blackwood Manor. Marcus frowned. He had heard the name, of course. A place shrouded in local whispers, a repository of provincial anxieties and embellished tales. He dismissed it as a relic of pre-industrial credulity. His great-aunt, he recalled, had been a recluse, a woman rumored to possess an eccentric fascination with the macabre. He suspected her legacy was less a gift and more a final, inconvenient gesture. A subsequent call from the solicitor, a brisk, impersonal voice, confirmed the necessity of his physical presence to finalize the transfer. Marcus sighed. His research would have to wait. He packed a single valise, his mind already cataloging the disruption to his meticulously planned schedule. He would attend to the legalities, assess the property's market value, and then return to his sanctuary of scholarship. The notion of living in a place associated with such antiquated superstitions was, to him, absurd. The journey began under a clear autumn sky, but as his hired vehicle traveled further north, the landscape grew increasingly stark. The paved roads gave way to narrower, winding tracks, the trees thicker, their branches forming a dense, interlocking canopy that obscured the sun. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of pine and decaying leaves. Marcus watched the passing scenery, a historian's detachment allowing him to appreciate the geological shifts, the remnants of ancient glacial activity. Eventually, the vehicle began its ascent into the mountain pass. The road here was a precarious ribbon of asphalt clinging to sheer rock faces. On one side, jagged peaks clawed at the slate-gray sky. On the other, a dizzying drop into a valley swathed in mist. The wind howled through the crevices, a low, sustained groan that vibrated through the vehicle's chassis. Marcus felt the subtle shift in pressure, a dull ache beginning behind his eyes. He found himself gripping the armrest more firmly than necessary, a physical reaction he attributed to the treacherous conditions, not to any nascent unease. "Almost there, sir," the driver announced, his voice tight, eyes fixed on the twisting road. He was a local, a man whose face was etched with the hard lines of outdoor work. Marcus noted the man's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Blackwood Manor, isn't it?" The driver continued, his tone dropping almost a whisper. "Been empty for years, mostly. Folks around here? Well, they steer clear." He glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror, a brief, speculative look. Marcus offered a curt nod. Local legends, Marcus presumed. He kept his voice even, betraying no interest in the driver's implicit warnings. Such narratives were the domain of the uneducated, not the serious scholar. The driver merely grunted, accelerating slightly as the road straightened for a short stretch. Then, through a sudden break in the dense, ancient forest, Blackwood Manor appeared. It was immense. The surrounding trees, gnarled and ancient, pressed in close, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the structure. No manicured lawns, no welcoming flower beds. Only an unkempt wilderness of thorny bushes and overgrown ivy that scaled the walls, obscuring details, blurring the line between building and encroaching nature. A rusted wrought iron gate, leaning precariously on one hinge, marked the entrance to a long gravel drive. The driver slowed, then stopped. "This is as far as Marcus goes, sir," he said, his voice flat. He refused to meet Marcus's gaze, instead focusing on the distant peaks. "The track's not good for the car beyond this point." Marcus understood. It was an excuse. He paid the man, collected his valise, and watched the vehicle turn, its taillights quickly swallowed by the descending gloom of the mountain pass. He stood alone, the wind whipping at his coat, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else. Something metallic and faintly acrid, like old iron mixed with decay. The silence was profound, broken only by the whistling wind and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. He pushed the gate open. It groaned in protest, a drawn-out, mournful sound. His footsteps crunched on the gravel as he approached the front door. He found a heavy iron knocker shaped like a gargoyle's head and rapped it against the wood. The sound was swallowed instantly by the sheer mass of the house, no echo returning. He located a ring of keys on his person, provided by the solicitor. The largest, a formidable iron key, slid into the lock with surprising ease. A series of metallic clacks resonated deep within the door's mechanism. He turned the handle. A wave of frigid air, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something indefinable, something ancient and cloying, washed over him. He stepped across the threshold. The floorboards beneath his feet groaned. The space was vast, a grand hall stretching into the gloom, lit only by the faint dying light filtering through grimy, leaded windows high above. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams, swirling like phantom insects. But another, less academic sensation began to prickle at his skin. He felt an inexplicable weight, a subtle pressure on his eardrums. He walked deeper into the hall, his footsteps echoing unnaturally. The house felt less like an empty structure and more like a vast, dormant organism. He was within it, and it was waiting. The last tremors of the departing vehicle faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the mountain pass. Marcus stood, the wind of physical presence, tearing at his coat, seeking purchase beneath his collar. The air, thin and sharp, carried the distinct, earthy aroma of damp soil and stagnant water. But beneath it, a faint, almost metallic tang persisted, an unsettling note he couldn't quite place. He tightened his grip on the handle of his valise, its weight a small, familiar comfort against the overwhelming scale of the manor looming before him. Its silhouette, jagged against the bruised twilight, seemed to absorb the last vestiges of natural light, leaving only deeper shadows in its wake. He ascended the flagstone path, each step a deliberate intrusion. The heavy oak door, scarred and weathered, yielded with a groan that echoed through the cavernous entrance hall. Marcus's historian's eye immediately cataloged the decay. Peeling wallpaper, cobwebbed chandeliers, the vast, empty spaces where grand furniture once stood. Drafts, neglect, the sheer volume of air within the structure. He found a suitable room on the ground floor, a former library, he surmised, given the towering, empty bookshelves lining 3 walls. This would be his anchor, his intellectual fortress against the encroaching desolation. Methodically, Marcus began to unpack. His fingers, accustomed to the brittle texture of old parchment, carefully arranged volumes on the table. Local histories, architectural surveys, genealogical records of the region's prominent families. He placed his laptop, a beacon of modern utility, squarely in the center. As he reached for a particularly dense tome on regional folklore, a sudden sharp drop in temperature enveloped his left arm. He paused, his breath momentarily catching. He looked around, noting the closed windows, the lack of discernible drafts. "Old house," he murmured, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. Inefficient heating, structural anomalies. He rubbed his arm, the sensation lingering before resuming his task. Hours bled into a deepening twilight that painted the library in shades of gray. Marcus worked, engrossed in a particularly obscure family tree. He had placed his favorite fountain pen, a brass instrument with a distinct heft, precisely beside his open notebook. He looked away for a moment, consulting a map, then returned his gaze to the table. The pen was no longer where he'd left it. It lay several inches to the right, angled differently, almost as if nudged. He frowned. He was meticulous, almost pathologically so, about the placement of his tools. He picked it up, examined it, then carefully placed it back in its original position. Fatigue, he decided, rubbing his temples, imagining things. It was indistinct, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or perhaps the rustle of old paper. He froze, head cocked. The house was utterly silent, save for the distant moan of the wind against a chimney. He waited, straining to hear it again, but there was nothing. Only the heavy, expectant quiet. He shook his head. The wind, he rationalized aloud, his voice flat. Through a loose pane, perhaps. Or the settling of timbers. He was a man of logic, of empirical evidence, and he would not concede to fanciful notions born of an overactive imagination in an isolated, decaying building. His research, however, soon offered a more tangible distraction. While attempting to clear a layer of grime from the underside of the oak table, he noticed a subtly misaligned section of wood. His fingers, probing, discovered a small, almost invisible seam. With a gentle tug, a shallow drawer slid open, revealing not dust, but a stack of leather-bound journals, their covers brittle with age, their pages yellowed and curling. They were unlike the official records he'd been handling. These were personal, intimate. He pulled the topmost journal out. The leather crackled. The handwriting inside was spidery, faded, yet imbued with a frantic energy. Further in, described the fading, the terrible fading of faces, of names, of who I once was. The author, identified only by an initial, detailed a growing struggle to maintain clarity, a constant battle against the house's insidious hunger. Marcus's brow furrowed. The language was florid, overwrought, characteristic of the era, but the underlying sentiment was undeniably one of profound distress. He read on, his earlier rationalizations beginning to feel thin, stretched. The metallic tang in the air seemed to sharpen. Something watchful. Marcus froze, a book half open on his lap, the photocopied census records scattered across the large oak desk. The faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering, had been unmistakable. He held his breath, listening. The distant moan, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, persisted. It was a sound he had begun to associate with the house itself. A deep, structural complaint, perhaps the wind finding a particularly resonant crevice. The whisper, however, was different. It felt closer, more deliberate. He exhaled slowly, a puff of cool air in the otherwise still study. Fatigue, he concluded. The relentless quiet, the isolation of the manor perched on its lonely hill, could play tricks on a mind accustomed to the constant hum of urban life. He picked up his pen, attempting to refocus on the meticulous task of cross-referencing names and dates. It was a prickle at the nape of his neck, a sensation of being observed. Nothing. He turned his head sharply, but the space was empty, filled only with the encroaching gloom. A trick of the light, he rationalized, or perhaps a dust mote catching the last faint glow from the desk lamp. He continued his research, driven by a historian's relentless curiosity. The manor's history was fragmented, a patchwork of property deeds, local council archives, and scattered personal correspondence he had found in a locked strongbox in the library. He sought patterns, connections between the various owners who had occupied the house over the centuries. A disturbing trend began to emerge, not immediately obvious, but undeniable once he started compiling a chronological list. The first documented owner, a wealthy merchant from the early 18th century, had reportedly taken his own life within the house after a period of intense reclusiveness. The cause of death was listed simply as melancholia. A century later, a land baron and his entire family vanished without a trace, leaving behind a perfectly preserved estate, their disappearance attributed to a sudden, inexplicable journey from which they never returned. Their belongings, including a half-eaten meal on the dining table, suggested an abrupt departure. A series of subsequent residents shared similar fates. One had been found wandering the mountain pass, disoriented and muttering incoherent phrases, before eventually succumbing to a profound mental deterioration in the care of a distant relative. Another, a solitary artist, had simply ceased all communication, his final journal entries descending into frantic looping scrawls that spoke of the walls listening and echoes of forgotten voices. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Madness, disappearance, suicide. He ran a hand over his tired face, the bristles of a day's growth scraping against his palm. He was a skeptic, a man of empirical evidence, but the sheer consistency of the historical record was difficult to ignore. He dismissed the artist's ramblings as the product of a disturbed mind, but the repetition of such outcomes was statistically improbable, even for a house as old and isolated as this one. Sleep did not come easily that night. The house seemed to settle around him, its ancient timbers groaning, the wind outside whistling a mournful tune through unseen gaps in the stone. He lay in bed, listening, his senses heightened. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, constant thrumming beneath the plaster. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing them away, trying to convince himself it was the blood rushing in his ears, or the wind. But they persisted, a cacophony of soft, unintelligible sounds that pressed in on him. When he finally drifted into an uneasy slumber, his dreams were vivid and disorienting. He was not himself, but a succession of others. He felt the crushing weight of an unseen despair, the frantic urge to escape, the terrifying certainty of being watched. He stumbled out of bed, needing a glass of water, his mind still clouded by the lingering tendrils of the nightmare. As he passed a tall, ornate mirror in the hallway, he caught a glimpse of movement behind his own reflection. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. Just the silent, waiting house. Marcus stood there, shivering, the clinical detachment he usually maintained beginning to fray at the edges. Marcus felt the lingering chill of his recent findings, the pattern of madness, disappearance, and suicide, a cold imprint on his thoughts. He had spent the morning trying to catalog the remaining boxes, but the effort felt futile, his attention fragmented. The academic detachment he prided himself on was eroding, replaced by a persistent, nagging unease. The manor itself seemed to watch him, its silence no longer tranquil but expectant. A floorboard groaned in the upper hall, a sound he had come to recognize as the house settling. Yet today, it felt like a sigh, heavy with an unspoken burden. He found himself pausing, listening, straining to discern something beyond the ambient creaks and groans. He moved to the library, drawn by an unfinished genealogical chart he'd been compiling. It traced the manor's previous owners, a lineage marked by prosperity and often abrupt, unsettling ends. As his gaze drifted over the intricate branches, a faint, metallic scent pricked the air. Something akin to old iron and damp earth, a smell he couldn't place within the house. He bent over the chart, trying to connect a particularly convoluted branch of the family tree, when a shimmer caught his eye. It wasn't the dust. It was a distortion in the air, directly over the polished oak of the desk. The outlines of the room wavered, and for a fleeting instant, the heavy velvet drapes seemed to shift, revealing not the overgrown garden outside, but a blizzard-whipped landscape. He saw a narrow, winding road choked with snow and a desolate, rocky expanse. It was the mountain pass, stark and unforgiving, the very route he had taken to reach this isolated dwelling. Then, as quickly as it appeared, It vanished, leaving only the familiar, dust-laden air. Marcus blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue, he rationalized. Too many late nights poring over documents. Too much isolation. His mind was playing tricks. He stood, pacing the worn rug, trying to shake the vividness of the image. The scent of iron and damp earth seemed stronger now, clinging to the air around him. He returned to the chart, determined to focus. He froze, listening. It wasn't outside, nor upstairs. It was here. He couldn't distinguish the words, but the emotional weight was palpable. The antique clock on the mantelpiece, long since silent, began to tick, a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to mock the frantic pace of his own pulse. Then, a visual element joined the auditory. In the periphery of his vision, a flicker of movement near the fireplace. She wrung her hands, a gesture of profound distress. The air grew heavy, thick with a sorrow that pressed in on him, suffocating. He wanted to speak, to call out, but his throat was tight. He simply watched, his mind struggling to reconcile what he saw with what he knew to be real. The woman turned her head slightly, and he saw the faint outline of her profile. A delicate jawline, hair pulled back severely. Her shoulders trembled. Suddenly, the image dissolved. The clock fell silent. The light returned to its normal, dusty dimness. He touched the polished surface of the desk, expecting to feel frost, but it was smooth and cool, as always. This was not a trick of the light, nor was it simple fatigue. The visions were too vivid, the emotions too potent. He felt watched, not by a presence in the room, but by the house itself. It was an omnipresent awareness, a silent judgment emanating from the very stone and timber. He was being assessed, scrutinized, as if the manor were a living entity, slowly turning him over in its consciousness. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The house, he realized with a sickening lurch, was not just replaying memories. It was consuming them, and perhaps him along with them. The bristles on his jaw scraped as he ran a hand across it. The cataloging effort stalled, the neat piles of documents and artifacts blurring into an undifferentiated mass. Days had folded into each other, the distinction between morning and evening growing tenuous. He rarely consulted his wristwatch anymore, the precise measurements of time feeling irrelevant within these walls. His initial attempts to maintain a semblance of routine had faltered. The razor lay unused on the bathroom counter, its blade dulling in the humid air. Meals became an afterthought, a forgotten necessity. A growing unease about his isolation began to prick at him. He needed supplies. He needed to touch base with the outside world. He remembered his intention to contact a colleague about the research. He located his mobile phone, its screen dark, the battery indicator a thin red sliver. He plugged it into a charger. The small, glowing light on the adapter offered a brief flicker of hope, a connection to the world beyond the manor's stone shell. He walked to the window overlooking the gravel drive, intending to assess the weather before attempting the drive down the mountain pass. The sky was an indifferent gray, the distant peaks shrouded in a soft haze. The route was steep and winding, prone to sudden shifts in conditions. He could almost feel the cold, sharp air of the high altitude, the biting wind that often swept through the narrow defiles. A peculiar heaviness settled in his chest, a reluctance that felt entirely his own, yet was inexplicably profound. The drive seemed an insurmountable effort. The thought of navigating the treacherous bends, the sheer drop-offs, seemed too demanding, too exhausting. He turned from the window, the idea of leaving dissipating like smoke. He told himself it could wait. The research demanded his full attention. Later, the phone, now partially charged, hummed in his hand. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing on the name of a senior historian he occasionally collaborated with. His thumb hovered over the call button. The air in the study felt still, expectant. He imagined the conversation, the questions he would have to answer, the the details he would need to recount. A profound weariness enveloped him. The effort seemed disproportionate to the potential benefit. It was as if the structure itself breathed, a slow, deep inhalation and exhalation that resonated with his own slowing pulse. The outside world, when he considered it, felt distant, irrelevant, almost hostile. The manor, despite its unsettling history, was becoming his sanctuary. One afternoon, a faint glint of brass caught his eye from behind a loose panel in the study's wainscoting. He pried it open with a letter opener. Inside, nestled on a bed of ancient, desiccated fabric, lay a small, tarnished locket. He pressed the clasp, and it sprang open with a faint click. On the other, etched into the brass, were 3 words: "Always within these walls." Marcus stared at the inscription. It was a conscious entity, an enduring presence that claimed its inhabitants. He placed it back into its hidden alcove, the thought of removing it never even crossing his mind. The manor had spoken, and he had heard. The neat piles of documents and artifacts blurred into an undifferentiated mass, the precise edges of parchment and polished wood dissolving into a haze before Marcus's eyes. He blinked, rubbing his temples, but the visual distortion persisted. A shimmering veil drawn over the room. The air grew heavier, thick and still, pressing against his eardrums. He stood, swaying slightly, the floorboards beneath his feet feeling unusually soft, almost yielding. He reached for the heavy oak desk, his fingers meeting not the expected solid grain, but a surface that felt inexplicably slick, cold, like polished stone. A tremor ran through him. This was his study, the room where he spent countless hours, yet it felt alien, its familiar contours subtly altered. The tall window, usually overlooking the overgrown gardens, now presented a vista of a sheer, moss-covered wall, slick with unseen moisture. He pressed his palm against the glass. It was frigid, radiating an unnatural chill. A sudden, sharp memory surfaced, not his own. He had no master. He was Marcus. Yet the conviction behind the memory was profound, visceral. He shook his head, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. He needed air, a change of scenery. He turned towards the door, but the wall where it should have been was now unbroken, covered in the same faded, intricate wallpaper that adorned the rest of the room. He moved along the wall, his hand sweeping across the pattern, searching for the familiar brass handle, the faint outline of the frame. Nothing. Only the continuous, unbroken surface. His breathing hitched. It was smaller now, the ceiling lower, the corners closing in. The fireplace, once a grand stone edifice, was now a crude opening, blackened and smelling faintly of ash and something metallic like old blood. He stumbled back, his foot catching on an unseen irregularity in the floor. He found another door, or what felt like one, set into a recess he did not recall. It was narrow, unadorned, and opened with a groan that seemed to echo from deep within the house's foundations. He hesitated, a strange compulsion urging him forward. He had to reach the archives, he thought, to find the ledger, to record the latest deliveries. Deliveries? What deliveries? He was a historian, cataloging an inheritance. The conflicting thoughts tangled, a knot of confusion tightening in his chest. The stone beneath his boots was uneven, slick with damp. The descent was steep, winding, the walls pressing in, rough and unforgiving. It was like traversing a subterranean passage, a path carved through solid rock. This was not the manor's usual staircase. This was something else, something primal and unforgiving. He felt the ascent of cold air, a draft like a breath from a crypt, carrying with it the scent of mineral earth and decay. The air thinned, and a strange pressure built in his ears. This was it, he realized, a mountain pass, treacherous and unforgiving, carved into the very heart of the earth. His breath plumed white in the frigid air. He was a fool to attempt this crossing in such conditions. He gripped the stone, his knuckles white, a desperate need to find shelter, to secure the supplies for the winter. The winter. I am a historian. But the conviction wavered. He looked down at his hands, seeing not his own familiar calloused fingers, but hands thinner, older, etched with lines of worry and hard labor. He saw a faded ring on his left hand, a simple silver band he had never owned. Whose hands were these? He knew with a certainty that eclipsed his own dwindling identity that he was the steward, tasked with keeping the accounts, ensuring the manor's survival through the harsh season. The distinction between Marcus, the historian, and the nameless steward, burdened by his duties, dissolved like mist on a high peak. He had to. The frigid air bit at Marcus's exposed skin, a shock that momentarily eclipsed the disorientation. He stood on a precarious ledge, a narrow ribbon of uneven rock barely clinging to the side of a sheer cliff. Below, a dizzying drop into a chasm veiled by mist. Above, jagged peaks clawed at a bruised, leaden sky. This was a mountain pass. The words formed in his mind with an academic precision, yet the landscape itself was utterly alien. He shivered, but it was not solely from the cold. A deeper tremor resonated within him, a vibration of existential dread. His last clear memory was of the library, the flickering lamp, the strange hands that were not his own. Now he was here. How? He pressed his palms against his temples, the rough wool of his jacket scratching his skin. His jacket. It felt familiar, yet the sensation was overlaid with an odd detachment, as if he were observing himself from a slight distance. He strained to hear, but only the raw force of the gale met his ears. He looked down at his boots, caked with fine gray dust, then at the treacherous path ahead, winding upwards into the gloom. There was no sign of a vehicle, no indication of how he had arrived. He was Marcus. He was a historian. He had inherited Blackwood Manor. These facts felt like carefully recited lines, learned but not wholly owned. He began to walk, each step deliberate, testing the uneven ground. The ascent was steep, demanding, and the thin air soon burned in his lungs. As he climbed, a faint impression formed in his awareness, not a memory, but a phantom echo of one. It was a sense of desperation, of flight, not his own desperation, but something borrowed, grafted onto his consciousness. The pass narrowed further, the rock face pressing in on him. He noticed faint, almost imperceptible scratches on the stone, parallel lines that spoke of a struggle, of fingernails perhaps, or something harder scraping for purchase. He reached out, his fingertips tracing the marks. They were old, weathered, but undeniably there. And then he saw it. Wedged into a crevice, half hidden by a clump of hardy mountain moss, was a small, tarnished silver locket. He retrieved it. It snapped open with a soft click. Inside, 2 miniature portraits. One, a stern-faced woman with eyes that seemed to hold a profound weariness. The other, a young man, his features blurred by time and oxidation, but his expression clearly one of acute distress. And etched onto the reverse of the locket, almost illegibly, was a single word. Consumed. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. This was a predator. Blackwood Manor was not a place. It was an entity. A malevolent, sentient organism that fed. It preyed on memories, on sanity, on the very life force of its inhabitants. The strange hands he had seen, the ring, the fragments of foreign lives that had begun to bleed into his own. These were the remnants, the partially digested memories of previous victims, now cycling through him. The manor was not just blurring the lines between past and present. It was metabolizing the past, turning it into a nutrient for its own growth, a weapon to break down the defenses of its current meal. He looked around the desolate mountain pass, a sudden, horrifying clarity washing over him. This was where some had tried to escape. This was the edge of its reach, the boundary it enforced. He was not merely an occupant, not merely an inheritor. He was its current, preferred meal. The manor was not a static, ancient structure. It was a living, breathing hunger. And it was feasting on him, slowly, meticulously, savoring each memory, each piece of his identity, until there would be nothing left but an empty vessel, another ghost to fuel its endless appetite. He had been so wrong, and the cost of that error was his very existence. The realization arrived with a cold, precise dread. Consumed. Not merely haunted by lingering echoes, but actively, malevolently devoured. Marcus felt a subtle shift within his own perception, a faint, metallic taste on his tongue, as if the house had just taken another bite. Yet this clarity, born of stark terror, also ignited a defiant spark. He was not yet fully absorbed. A small, tenacious part of him remained, a core of resistance. His breath hitched, shallow and rapid. His historian's mind, even under duress, sought patterns, weaknesses. There had to be an antidote, a method of severing its hold, or perhaps even destroying it. Escape felt improbable, the house's boundaries now seeming to stretch beyond the physical walls, encompassing the very air he breathed. Destruction, then, became the singular, desperate objective. He moved with a frantic energy, a stark contrast to the creeping inertia that had been settling upon him for weeks. The library, a repository of forgotten lives, seemed the most logical starting point. Its shelves, once comforting in their neat rows, now appeared as a labyrinth of potential traps, each tome a silent witness to countless previous inhabitants' slow erosion. The silence was not empty. It vibrated with a low hum, a subtle pressure against his eardrums, the house's constant hungry presence. His fingers, slightly tremulous, swept across leather-bound spines, pulling out forgotten journals, architectural plans, and local histories. He focused, sifting through pages yellowed with age, searching for anomalies, for anything that deviated from the mundane records of property transfers and family trees. He discovered a recurring motif in the marginalia of several texts. A stylized, thorny vine, meticulously drawn. It appeared in a gardener's ledger detailing plant species, in a cook's recipe book alongside notes on preservation, and even in a child's primer adorning the capital letters. It was more than a decorative flourish. It was too consistent, too deliberate. The vine always seemed to lead to a single recurring symbol, a jagged, inverted triangle. Hours bled into a timeless blur. His eyes burned, his throat felt parched. The house, sensing his purpose, intensified its efforts. The floorboards groaned with the weight of unseen passage. He finally located a small, leather-bound volume, tucked away behind a row of obscure geological surveys. Its title was simply, The Burden of Stone. The pages were brittle, the script arcane. It wasn't a history, but a compilation of local folklore, annotated by an unknown hand, likely a former owner. The book spoke of the land itself, the mountain pass where the manor stood, as having an ancient primordial claim. It described a root heart of malevolence, not just within the manor, but beneath it, drawing sustenance from the earth and, through the manor, from the living. The thorny vine symbol reappeared, explicitly identified as a representation of this root heart's tendrils, and the inverted triangle as its vulnerability. The text detailed a forgotten ritual, not of exorcism, but of severance. The ritual was complex, involving a precise sequence of actions, a specific incantation, and a profound act of sacrifice. The author of the annotations, clearly a previous inhabitant driven to similar desperation, had meticulously cross-referenced the celestial alignment with astronomical charts, indicating a window of opportunity that was, terrifyingly, only days away. A wave of dizziness washed over Marcus. The weight of the book, the sheer audacity of its claims, the impossible task it laid before him, threatened to crush his fragile lucidity. He understood now. They were the terrifyingly literal means to cut the cord, to starve the predator. As he closed the book, a faint, high-pitched whine emanated from the walls, a sound akin to grinding stone, but imbued with a nascent fury. The house knew. It knew he had found something, a weakness in its ancient, terrible design. The glimmer of resistance had been perceived, and the full weight of the manor's malevolence now began to turn its focus squarely upon him. The game had changed. The metallic taste lingered, sharp and coppery, coating Marcus's tongue. He stood in the great hall, the air thick and stagnant, the silence pressing in. The clarity of his realization, consumed, had solidified into a chilling certainty. It wasn't merely an echo of past suffering. It was an active, predatory hunger. The house, he now understood, was not just a container for malevolence, but the malevolence itself, a vast, complex organism with an insatiable appetite for consciousness. Nothing moved. Yet the air had grown dense, as if the very atoms of the hall were compressing around him. Then, a sound. Not a creak, but a sharp, concussive thwack that echoed from the eastern wing. Marcus flinched, his head snapping towards the source. It was the study door, previously ajar, now slammed shut with a force that rattled the ancient oak frame. He had not seen it move. No gust of wind, no visible entity. Just the instantaneous, violent closure. A deliberate act. He took a step, then another, moving cautiously towards the study. The wood felt different, rougher, the grain seeming to writhe under his fingertips. He grasped the handle and twisted. It was locked. Not merely stuck, but firmly, impossibly secured. He had left it unlocked. This was new. It was asserting itself, physically impeding his movements. He tried the handle again, twisting harder, a desperate grunt escaping his lips. The door remained steadfast, an immovable barrier. He spun around, searching the hall. The banister, carved with intricate griffins, appeared to extend, its claws sharpening, its wings unfurling in an optical illusion that sent a shiver down his spine. He blinked, and the effect receded, but the impression remained. His research had been purely academic, focused on the manor's historical inhabitants and their documented misfortunes. Now he needed a different kind of map. The library, he decided, was his best option. He moved with a new urgency, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the polished floor. As he approached the archway leading to the library corridor, the air grew frigid. A faint, cloying scent, like damp earth mixed with something metallic, assailed his nostrils. He pushed through the archway, only to find the corridor transformed. The familiar sequence of paintings depicting stoic ancestors was gone. In their place, the wallpaper had peeled back to reveal raw, unhewn stone. The corridor itself had narrowed, the walls pressing in, making the passage feel like a constricted throat. He pressed forward, his shoulders scraping against the rough stone. The passage seemed to lengthen, the library door receding into the gloom. He was certain it had been closer moments ago. A low, guttural growl seemed to emanate from the stone itself, vibrating against his cheek. He stumbled, catching himself on the uneven wall. Suddenly, a spectral form coalesced directly in his path. Marcus recoiled, falling backward onto the grimy floor. He scrambled away, his breath catching in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure remained, blocking the path, its presence radiating an intense, palpable hatred. He could not pass. The house was actively fighting him. He retreated, backing out of the constricted passage, his eyes fixed on the spectral guardian. The moment he cleared the archway, the corridor seemed to normalize. The ancestral portraits returning, the walls receding. It was as if the house had reset the illusion, content to merely block him. The house wanted him disoriented, isolated, broken. He needed to think, to find another way. He moved towards the kitchen, a less frequented part of the manor, hoping for a moment of respite, a place where the house's influence might be weaker. But the house had no weak points. As he entered the kitchen, the familiar scent of stale cooking grease and mildew was replaced by something else entirely. The sharp, crisp air of high altitude, tinged with pine and wet rock. He was standing on a precipice, a sheer drop plummeting hundreds of feet below him. Before him stretched a vast, rugged mountain pass, its peaks shrouded in swirling mist, its valleys carved by ancient glaciers. The wind howled, whipping at his clothes, biting at his exposed skin. This was no vision within a room. This was the mountain pass. Then a voice, thin and reedy, carried on the wind. "You came here to find us, didn't you, Marcus?" It was the voice of a young woman, familiar yet distorted, like a memory half recalled. He knew this voice. He turned, scanning the swirling mist. She stood impossibly close to the edge, her hair whipping around her. "We waited," she said, her voice laced with a profound, ancient sorrow. "We waited for you to join us." He knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was one of the consumed, and he was inviting him to join her in an eternal fall. This was the house's true weapon, turning his own historical curiosity, his own empathy for the lost, against him. Marcus took a deliberate step backward, away from the precipice, away from the beckoning figure. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to anchor himself, to remind himself that this was the kitchen, that the ancient manor was playing its cruelest trick yet. He forced his eyes open. The mountain pass remained. The wind still howled. But the metallic taste on his tongue, a reminder of the house's consumption, sparked a flicker of defiance. He would fight. The metallic tang remained, a persistent phantom on Marcus's tongue, a flavor of rust and something far older, far more deeply seated in the structure around him. It was the house's signature, a grim reminder of its constant, silent consumption. He pushed forward, the weight of the manor pressing in from all sides. The grand hallway, once a testament to forgotten opulence, now seemed to undulate, the patterns in the wallpaper swirling into grotesque, indistinct faces. Each step echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. He could feel the house's awareness, a cold, predatory intelligence watching his every move, anticipating his intent. The familiar layout of the manor began to distort. A corridor he knew led to the library, now twisted into a narrow, ascending passage. The air thinned, a biting glacial draft whipping through the confined space, carrying with it the faint, echoing moan of wind through unseen crags. This was no longer merely a house. The uneven floor, strewn with loose pebbles and shards of crumbling masonry, shifted beneath his boots. Above him, the ceiling vanished into an inky blackness that seemed to stretch infinitely, mimicking a night sky devoid of stars. His breath plumed white in the frigid air. They were not words, not distinct phrases, but a cacophony of lost emotions. Fear, regret, longing. A chorus of all those the house had consumed. They coiled around him, seeking to burrow into his mind, to plant seeds of doubt and despair. His plan, meticulously researched, now felt impossibly fragile in the face of this overwhelming sentient presence. He clutched the heavy, iron-bound volume he carried, its pages filled with his hurried notes and the arcane symbols he'd transcribed from the manor's oldest, most hidden texts. This was his weapon, his shield. The mountain pass finally opened into a vast, circular chamber, its existence defying the manor's architectural blueprints. It was the heart, the nexus. The air here was still, thick, and suffocating, vibrating with an almost audible hum. Within this swirling expanse, Marcus could discern fleeting images. A woman weeping into his hands, a child's startled eyes, a man's silent scream. They were not mere projections. They were residual energies, imprints, the very essence of the house's past inhabitants, trapped, processed, and slowly absorbed. It was not blood, Marcus knew, but something more insidious, the concentrated byproduct of countless consumed lives. Above it, suspended in the air without visible support, hung a pulsating orb of obsidian-like material, roughly the size of a man's head. This was the core. This was the house's true ravenous maw, where memory, sanity, and life force were transformed into sustenance. Each pulse was a beat of absorption, a slow, deliberate act of devouring. The shifting images in the walls were not ghosts. They were the raw material, the essence being drawn into the orb, processed, leaving behind only an empty echo. The house didn't just feed, it transformed, rendering its victims into pure, undifferentiated energy for its continued existence. A profound weariness, deeper and more insidious than before, washed over Marcus. The house was now directing its full force against him, attempting to overwhelm his mind with the collective despair of its victims. This was the threshold. This was the final stand. With a guttural cry that sounded thin and reedy in the vast, humming chamber, Marcus raised the heavy volume, its binding cracking under the strain. The air shimmered, and the obsidian orb pulsed faster, its malevolence now focused entirely on him. He resisted, a knot of stubborn refusal tightening in his gut. He was Marcus, a historian, a skeptic, and he would not simply dissolve. He moved through the echoing halls, his footsteps unnaturally loud, as if the house itself amplified them, mocking his presence. The walls seemed to pulse, a subtle, almost imperceptible undulation that set his teeth on edge. He could feel eyes on him, not the eyes of a specific specter, but the collective, ancient gaze of the manor itself, observing, assessing, preparing. His destination was the lowest cellar, a place he had avoided since the initial inspection, deeming it structurally unsound and historically barren. Now it called to him with a quiet insistence, a hollow resonance that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his bones. He descended the rough-hewn stone steps, each tread sending a shiver through the decrepit structure. The temperature plummeted, a raw, biting cold that seeped into his marrow. At the bottom, the space opened into a cavernous chamber, unlit save for a faint phosphorescent glow emanating from the damp stone walls. Here, the metallic scent was overwhelming, a cloying, visceral presence. The walls were not merely damp, they wept. Drops of viscous, rust-colored fluid seeped from the mortar, gathering in shallow puddles on the uneven flagstones. Marcus knelt, touching a finger to the liquid. This was the house's lifeblood, its digestive fluid. As he stood, a sudden, profound shift occurred. The cellar walls seemed to stretch, to grow impossibly high, the glowing moisture on their surface becoming slick ice. The air thinned, biting at his lungs. The chamber transformed, not visually, but experientially. A cold wind, sharp with the scent of pine and stone, whipped at his face, though no such wind existed indoors. This was the house's true weapon. Not illusion, but absolute sensory immersion, a complete resculpting of his perception. He felt the precipice, the dizzying drop, the desperate need for purchase. He clutched at the rough stone, his knuckles white. "No," he rasped, his voice stolen by the wind that wasn't there. "This isn't real." But it felt real. His mind, already frayed, struggled to distinguish. They were travelers, explorers, inhabitants of this house across centuries, all caught on this same illusory mountain pass, all trying to escape, or perhaps all being led to their final, inescapable destination. Their memories, their fears, their very essences were the fabric of this place. Then came the reveal. Not a vision, but a sudden, terrifying clarity. The house didn't just consume memories and life force, it integrated them. It was a vast organic archive. Each absorbed mind a new facet of its consciousness. Each forgotten life a new stone in its structure. He wasn't being eaten. He was being absorbed. His identity to be dissolved and repurposed. His unique perspective becoming another lens through which the house perceived the world. Another voice in its silent internal chorus. He saw his childhood home, not through his eyes, but as if from a distant clinical vantage point. He saw his research, his colleagues, his life, all laid out like specimens in a sterile display, devoid of emotion, stripped of personal significance. They were data points for the house to catalog. There was no escape. The mountain pass was not a path out, but a journey in, deeper into the house's being. His resistance, his struggle, his fear. These were merely the final rich flavors for the entity to savor before full assimilation. He felt a profound weariness, deeper than any he had known. The metallic tang in his mouth intensified, becoming not a taste, but a sensation, as if his very tongue were turning to rust. He was one of them. He was a passage. He was a chamber. A final thought, fragmented and fading, tried to surface. I am Marcus. But the name felt alien, distant, a relic. The pervasive quiet that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was the quiet of absorption, complete and utter. The house was sated.